This is really a time of transition here in the Diocese of Grand Rapids as we move from one leadership to another. It's a time of personal transition for me as the diocesan bishop, as I become the Bishop Emeritus of the diocese, along with Bishop Rose. And I'm delighted to be with you today to celebrate this very special time as we do on this feast of the body and blood of the Lord. I think it's important for us to reflect for a moment about this transition. And what's important about it is to recognize that as priests, and those who serve as priests in our diocese, you don't retire in the usual sense of that word. You go and you work for a company and you reach your retirement point and you turn your keys in, and then you just move on to other things, and you come back a little later and they wonder what you're doing hanging around there. The closest thing that I was thinking about that I could think of is attorneys have a role that's called to be of counsel. That means you're retired, but they humor you and make you feel that you're very much part of everything. As I reflected on this, though, Cardinal Dearden used to say, it's important that we recognize that priests do not retire, you become senior priests. Because what you cease doing is the day-to-day administration, the day-to-day governance of a diocese or a parish, but you continue to have responsibilities for the sanctifying and the teaching office of the church. And so that certainly will continue to be part of my life here in the Diocese of Grand Rapids, assisting in parishes and serving in whatever way that I can. As someone has once said, you know, one of the wonderful things about retiring is that you can do whatever you want. Some of my friends have said, well, that won't be a change because you've always done that anyway. And I won't comment on that either. So I welcome our visitors here today, and I welcome in a special way those who are watching us on television and on the internet. And I want to begin by expressing a sincere thanks to all of you for your support, for your prayers, for your love and your friendship over these years. And it is my confident hope that that will all continue as we move forward and as we transition to new leadership and I assume the role of Bishop Emeritus. One of the things that I began to do when I first came to Grand Rapids was to visit each of the parishes. And in the course of the years that I've been here, I've probably visited each parish probably 3 or 4 times over the course of those years. And it was always important for me to come to those parishes to celebrate the liturgy, to celebrate the Eucharist on a Sunday or on a Saturday night, when the community gathered to proclaim the death of the Lord as we do in our celebration here today. As you know, there are many things that go on in parish life. There are many things that go on in our community. There are various social activities, issues of social justice. There are issues of various educational efforts that take place, whether it be religious education programs or whether it be schools. But none of this has any meaning if it is viewed outside the context of the celebration of the Eucharist, where the community gathers on a Sunday and on the weekend to proclaim the death of the Lord. Because everything needs to flow from the altar, and everything needs to come back to the altar in our offering of ourselves to the Lord and in the offering of our service. And I would just like to invite you to reflect on that in your own lives as well. I think one of the difficulties that we have, and as it's worth reflecting on as we celebrate this feast of the body and blood of the Lord, is the temptation that we have to take the Eucharist for granted, to assume that it's always available to us. And certainly for those of us who live in metropolitan areas or urban areas, it's just a matter of what time you want to choose to go. And so if you look around the diocese, beginning about 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon through about 7 or 7:30 at night here in the diocese, anytime you want to go to Mass, you can find a place to go. And as I was reflecting on that, it sometimes can mean that it can become more of a convenience for us than a real expression of what we are about, although it certainly is a tribute to our faith that people do that and that they move around to try to find convenient times. I recall as a youngster and I'm talking about a real youngster before I even started school, we lived in the country, and there was no local parish nearby, and we used to go to the church or the little chapel where my grandparents lived, and they only used to have Mass there about once a month. And then sometimes we would go to the place where my father's family grew up, and they would have Mass there once a month too. So if you kind of moved around the country a bit, you could find Mass on Sunday. But one of the interesting things about those celebrations was that when there was Mass on Sunday, the whole community gathered, and it was truly a community event. There was a time when everybody came together and everybody made a special effort to be there. After Mass, I remember, standing outside the church and listening to the folks talk as they visited there were no coffee and donuts then, by the way. That's a more recent innovation in the church. But it didn't keep people from visiting, and it didn't keep people from talking to each other. One of the things I remember vividly is that the pastor had gotten a new car, and that was certainly the object of the discussion after one of the Sunday Masses anyway, and he felt it necessary to describe why he needed a new car in his homily that day. Now, I remember that as somebody who was a preschool student for some reason or other. But anyway, it was the Eucharist was important to that community. They came together at other times for social things, but when the Eucharist was there was a very special time. And I remember that being a very special time in my own life too, as I was part of that gathering. The other incident that comes to my mind is there was a retired priest. His name was Father Ed Hurley. He was not a relative of mine. And I became the pastor of St. Lucy Parish in St. Clair Shores, and he was in residence there at the time. He had been a former army chaplain during the Second World War, and he had been a prisoner of war for a number of years and was released finally when the war came to an end. And he never talked about his experiences as a prisoner of war or his time in the service, as so many people who lived in those times do not speak of those days. And I remember going to his funeral, and next to his casket, there was this little tiny wooden chalice that had been carved by hand. It was barely large enough to put anything in it at all. And when he was in the prisoner of war camp, he used to use that as a way to celebrate Mass in whatever way that he could. I doubt that he observed all the rubrics that we observe in our own ritual today, and I'm sure there was no music and there was no responsorial psalm or none of that. But the Eucharist was so important to him, and it was the means that gave him hope and enabled him to look to the future. It was a means that he was in touch with his God, and he asked the Lord's blessing. I can't begin to tell you how touched I was by seeing that. We had lived together over a number of years during the time that I was there, and he never once spoke of it, and I never once knew it. And it was only when I saw that little chalice that I truly realized how much he loved the Lord and how much he loved the Eucharist and how important it was to him and how important it had been all of his life. He's one man I had a lot of respect for him. And I would sometimes say to him, well, Ed, there have to be a lot of advantages to growing old. And he would just look at me and he'd say, would you mind naming one of them, please, so I could know? But it was very special to him, and I think it needs to be special to us as well. But I remember being very touched by that in a very special kind of way. So I think it's important for us as we gather here today to reflect on our own understanding of the Eucharist and how important it is for us. And when we begin to look to the convenience of things, we can sometimes get into some interesting situations. I remember not too long ago receiving a letter from somebody in one of our parishes where the pastor had changed the Mass schedule, and they would not be going to Mass anymore because they always went to that Mass, and they just were not going to go anymore because they didn't have a Mass at 7:30 in the morning or whatever time it was. And then another day I got another letter from somebody asking that I remove the pastor of the parish because he had moved some chairs in the back of the church where this family used to sit. And they always sat there. They had sat there for many, many years. And he moved those chairs, and they couldn't go to church there anymore because the chairs had been moved. Well, you know, sometimes I think, and I use those just as examples of perhaps some extreme things, but I think we can all find ourselves with all sorts of reasons not to appreciate the great gift that God has given to us in the Eucharist, and it becomes so convenient for us that we can at times take the Lord's presence for granted. So I think it's important for us today, as we celebrate this feast of the body and blood of the Lord, to reflect on the letter from St. Paul to the Corinthians that we heard today. I received from the Lord what I handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was handed over, took bread, and after he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you." And then, in the similar way, he took the cup and he said, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes." We do this and we celebrate this Eucharist today in remembrance of the Lord, not because we have chosen to do it, but because God has come and made his dwelling place among us. We celebrate the Lord's presence in different ways. We celebrate his presence in his spoken word. We celebrate his presence in the assembled community as we have here today. But more importantly, we celebrate his presence in the Eucharist that we share in as we break bread and we share a cup and as we proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. And so this transition that we find ourselves in is just that. It's a transition. The substance remains the same. We are all, as God's people, called together to pass on to others what we have received, namely that we know the love of God in our lives, that we experience it, and that the Lord has loved us so very much that not only did he give of himself for us, he gave us his very body and blood as a sacrament to nourish us and to strengthen us. So let us all, as God's people, be his ever faithful people and appreciate this rich gift that God has given to us as a sign of his love in his body and in his blood, which we celebrate in this Eucharist today.